This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
This is Jole Bagnal, Director of Federal for SpyCloud.
Today, we're going to talk about collecting data from the criminal underground. Hit the music, Claude.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we're going to talk to a company called SpyCloud based in Austin, Texas, and we're going to get an individual by the name of Jole Bagnal. We're going to talk about some ways that this company collects information to help increase security for the federal government. But before we begin, there are probably a lot of people who know your background, Joel. Maybe you can tell us a little about your background and why you're so uniquely qualified to be in this position.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here today talking with you. I started my career in 1986 after I graduated from West Point as an infantry officer, then spent the next 20 years in the U.S. Army and special mission units and in some policy positions. On 9/11, I was actually in the Pentagon when the plane hit the building and had just completed a study of asymmetric warfare, which was curiously coincidental. I found myself about 1 month later over at the White House working on the new established Homeland Security Council as a policy director working incident management and threats. From there, I stayed at the White House for the next 7.5 years, retired my military commission, took on a presidential commission, and served in various positions during the Bush 43 presidential administration, focused on Homeland Security and counterterrorism. And when I left during the transition from President Bush to President Obama, I moved to Austin, Texas, and I've been focused on cybersecurity, commercial and federal, for the past 14 years.
Well, I can summarize it pretty quickly. You know, you've seen it from the trenches to the White House. I mean, you have the range that very few of my guests have. That's a really incredible range, isn't it?
It's been a wonderful experience, and I've had the opportunity to see how government operates at the state and the federal level, and also the cross-section of state capabilities and commercial capabilities in the cybersecurity industry, which needs a lot more work in terms of cooperation and collaboration to make it more effective. But there is a growing sense of urgency in the United States to ensure that our very best that we have to offer as a nation is being used by critical infrastructure, federal government, state and local governments, and commercial industry to create the best kinds of protection and security possible.
I'm going to state the obvious. You have obviously worked with some three-letter organizations, and you are privy to information that you're not going to talk about. And it's kind of interesting that with your background, you have chosen to work with SpyCloud. And when I see someone like you consciously choosing SpyCloud, I'm thinking, well, there's got to be a reason for it. Maybe this is bang for the buck. This is very good value. Everyone talking about value today and return on investment. And so what kind of value can SpyCloud bring for the federal customer?
SpyCloud is a big data analytics company that operates in the dark web, the deepest parts of the dark web, where we acquire information very early, right after a breach has taken place. And we have early warning access to an enormous amount of PII or personal identifiable information. And we operate at the intersection of human identity and IT infrastructure. So we're very effective at attribution and helping to find the malicious actors that are operating in the criminal underground, whether it's nation state sponsored or whether it's strictly financially or criminal motivated for nefarious purposes. We have about a third of the world's population now in our database, and we have high efficacy of accuracy in identifying bad actors on the web. So we provide attribution information, we provide criminal behavior information, we provide, most importantly, a pattern of life or pattern of behavior analysis to federal agencies so they can support their missions with this data and achieve successful mission outcomes.
I went to your website this morning, SpyCloud.com, wealth of information. I think if you're listening to this and there's snow on the ground and you want to learn more, I downloaded the 2022 Identity Exposure Report, and then my jaw hit the ground and I went back up and I said, I don't believe these numbers. come on now. If you read the numbers in this report, 200 billion recaptured assets. I mean, Joel and his team, they are searching the dark web for assets and information that I can't believe the amount of information. Isn't it shocking?
It is unbelievable that we've been able to amass 200 billion assets over the past 6 years. And what's really interesting now that we've established ourselves and as an expert in this enriched identity area of expertise, we are now acquiring about 1 billion new records a month. And it's just fascinating how well our engineering team has put together a rather complex collection mechanism that then we can parse into searchable fields. We curate the data in a way that makes it very easy for any user to understand. And then we analyze the information so that queries against our data lake achieve very strong results in the areas that you're interested in trying to support your mission as a federal customer. And then we further enrich the analysis by providing a feedback loop between the federal customer, their use cases, and how we can better enrich our data to help them achieve successful mission outcomes quicker. So a lot of words there, but we have had a relationship now with the intelligence community and Department of Defense and several law enforcement agencies for a number of years that have given us the ability to put domain expertise, subject matter expertise into our algorithms and analytical products that help the government better achieve understanding who's doing the bad thing on the web.
When you're at West Point, I'm sure you studied wars through the centuries, maybe even wars in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they had these castles and these moats, and they could pretty much establish a perimeter pretty easily. Some people say today that identity is a new perimeter. There's no moat, there's no wall, there's no firewall. And so if identity is a new perimeter, being accurate with identification seems to be a good first step towards this big concept of zero trust, isn't it?
It really is. Attribution has been one of the top 3 cybersecurity mission requirements since we stood up the cybersecurity organizations in the federal government over 15 years ago. So if you look at U.S. Cyber Command and then the intelligence community agencies that are focused on cyber, and then the new agency at Department of Homeland Security that's focused on cybersecurity and infrastructure security analysis, it is unbelievable where attribution and the identification of infrastructure associated with human identity has achieved an apex now, and it's one of the most important elements of mission requirements for the federal government. And we are right in the sweet spot of that.
We know just a little bit about your background, but you've been involved in heavy, high-level areas of legislation and recommendation policy. And so I don't normally go into the policy area, but you're just the perfect person to talk about policy because you got this practical background too. So if you look at the policy and legislation coming up, we see initiatives, we see this, we see that. Are there challenges or gaps you see that maybe they aren't covering in some of these increasing reports about, for example, data management and about identity management and move to zero trust? Are the gaps there in those reports coming out?
We have made so much progress in the past couple of years, and the new executive order on cybersecurity that came out of the White House about a year ago, some of the new standards that are being published through NIST and also through the Department of Defense's CMMC program, new changes in identity management, the whole zero trust framework that's being implemented now by the federal government have all done a great job of ensuring that we're moving in a very positive direction more quickly with regard to security practices and also enduring policies that will make a difference in our ability to prevent the bad thing from happening. We've been in response mode for quite some time and shoring up our protections. But now we're starting to transition from, as a whole government, really from responding effectively to preventing the bad thing from happening in the first place. And so in that regard, some of these new policies are making a very positive impact. The notion of continuous monitoring, for example, and treating identity as a critical element of understanding the threat landscape, very, very important. And those have all done a great job of ensuring that we're doing a better job of securing our human as well as our digital and network assets. That said, there are some remaining gaps. We still do not have security culture set so that every individual that's operating on network is thinking about operational security and their own personal behavior associated with their mission organization 24/7. This needs to be ingrained in the culture, and that is an area where there's still a need for improvement. There are some things we can do automatically, though, to help with that challenge, with that hygiene challenge. And then where SpyCloud focuses its time and effort is ensuring that password usage is strong, and that if a password is being used in an environment that we can quickly identify that is a stolen or lost or missing credential associated with that person's identity, that it needs to be changed immediately so that we can ensure that's not being taken advantage of by malicious actors.
You mentioned zero trust. I'm sure if you went to Google Trends and typed in zero trust, you'd see, a big ramp up. It's being debated in many cybersecurity areas all over town. And one counter argument, or one argument people say was, well, zero trust is great, but what about the insider threat? And they've already identified themselves. And so is this an end game for you? And what can you do to help the insider threat who's already defeated zero trust?
Given the fact that we have so much identity information in our database, we have the ability to, through breach records and malware records and all the identity assets that we have in our data lake now, we have the ability to understand the person's behavior not only inside their work environment, but also outside their work environment with respect to social media or other accounts that they may have. Once an asset is breached, companies and government organizations will typically make sure that any endpoint devices associated with a network breach are cleaned or re-imaged and put back into operation as a new machine, as a new device. And what we fail to recognize sometimes is that the malware data and the breach data associated with that breach, even though you clean the hard drive and you re-image the machine, that malware and breach data is out there. And so if there are session cookies and PII and anomalous behaviors that we can attribute to individuals that still reside in those breach records, then we can follow that person's behavior, follow their path, understand their digital life, and with that understanding, we can assign a risk score associated with that individual that helps us understand when that individual is in a corporate entity or a government organization that they have a lot of information in their background that their bosses and their network administrators may be concerned about with respect to their behavior in their current job.
Magicians like to work by misdirection, and you look in one area and all of a sudden something goes to a different area. And so I see what can happen here is that people are worrying about identification. It's called the first pillar of zero trust. They're talking about human identification and attribution patterns and authentication. And all of a sudden you get hit by OT, operational technology. It's like, wait a minute, we spend 40 hours a week making sure Joel is Joel. And then someone from a phone system gets in, or someone from, I don't know, there's so many remote points now accessing coming in. And so does your company address issues involved with OT as well?
It does. And one of the advantages of converging infrastructure, which we've seen over the past 10 years or so, where OT and IT were largely separate and their functions have now been converged largely due to the requirements of more sensors and more efficiency. And that convergence from a threat landscape has increased the surface area, if you will, and the ability for threat actors to access OT in ways they weren't able to before. But it also allows for greater understanding of behaviors in OT environments, and that's where we come in. So when a breach does affect operational technology, we have the ability to pull in all that unique data and understand access points and enumeration of the attack surface and how the criminal element was able to gain access to that information. There's still an identity associated with the bad actor accessing that operational technology. And so SpyCloud, again, can offer a lot of very useful information and understanding how breaches take place, understanding lateral movement, understanding the identities associated with that bad behavior.
You're a young man, Joel. I've been around a while. I've seen all kinds of things. And I see these trends. And back when I had learned all the acronyms, role-based access control, access, but all those, we memorized those things years ago. And the trend up until recently has been to role-based access control. And what I see happening is switching more and more people talking about access-based access control as really a way to eliminate a lot of questions with access. So do you see this trend too, or am I just maybe listening to the wrong technology people when it comes to access controls?
No, there's definitely a trend in this area, and we're concerned about it as well. But again, behind every access point, there's an identity. There's an enumerated protocol that can be ascribed to an identity. And so we have to be more clever about how we're preventing behaviors through new access mechanisms. And there's a lot of good work being done right now and making sure that we have preventative capabilities in identity access management systems that we're concerned about. Well,
it's September 2022. We have to talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant's probably driving around a car out in front of your house. It's Uber. And well, I got you on the line. I got to ask the question about Uber. Have you studied much about Uber? Was it identity problem? Was it just a simple 16-year-old phishing attack? So what do you know about Uber you can share with us?
In terms of the breach, there's still quite a bit of studying that's being done right now to fully understand the attack, but it was substantial, and it definitely had to do with identity and credentials. This is how the attack point was initiated, and then there were other capabilities that were used to exercise lateral movement and be able to withdraw or take data from Uber. But taking advantage of identity was the way it was done.
In the commercial world, SpyCloud got a strong presence. I mean, we talk about many of the large organizations use your services as SpyCloud. And in the commercial world, they talk about account takeover, and they talk about fraud prevention. And you may think that's just, someone using their computer in St. Louis or someone using their computer in Oregon or something. But I think both of these aspects apply to the federal government as well. I mean, maybe not account takeover as easily with an individual's account, but fraud exists in many different levels, even in the federal government, doesn't it?
It does. If you think about student loan fraud and Medicare, Medicaid fraud, and the enormous amount of fraud that takes place with respect to IRS consumption and services every year. Veterans Administration is one of the leading organizations that has to combat fraud every year. So outside of the normal, notions of fraudulent activity and criminal activity in the commercial sector, that it is rampant in the federal sector as well. And so SpyCloud can be used to great effect to identify those that are perpetrating fraud.
When we opened up this podcast, I made kind of a whimsical reference to the criminal underground. But this isn't just whim. I mean, this is a heart attack, as they say. And so you gather, a lot of your company gathers a lot of information on the dark web and goes to the criminal underground. And you gather in passwords and you gather in email addresses. And so what happens is you can make one of your customers aware if someone has been compromised. Is that how we use this recaptured data?
That's exactly right. And so if we see stolen, lost, missing credentials in any of the breach data in our database, then we highlight that to our customers, and then it will then trigger an alert to inform that customer as well as the employee being affected that password needs to be changed. And so that simple identification and alert can help prevent an enormous amount of challenging activity in a network. It is clearly stated in a number of different reports, to include our own every year. Password usage and reusage of stolen and lost credentials is in basic hygiene or account for about 85% of all successful cyber attacks.
Wow. Yeah. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I always have interesting neighbors. One of my neighbor works for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's a physicist, big brainiac type guy. And he's a real smart guy. And I look at him, I say, well, he's probably not going to fall prey to some of these phishing scams or these fraudsters. However, if you look around, I think on your website, I saw the figure that .gov accounts are in that database that you have. There's something like 269,000 credentials for .gov in there. I mean, really? Yes, it's got nothing to do with your PhD in physics. I just think humans are humans, and they can be deceived, and all of a sudden their credentials are out there.
It has nothing to do with intellect, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with the morality of a person. It's interesting that criminals have just as bad password usage as good people do. And so that's one of the reasons why we're pretty effective at identifying their criminal behavior too, because not only of the enormous amount of PII that we have in our database, but also our password cracking capability gives us the opportunity to see criminal passwords in plain text format and understand their patterns that they're using to establish their false credentials or their false identity. And we have enough of that information now that we can see trend lines and understand, better inform ourselves how to crack passwords that criminals think are pretty clever, but they're not.
So if you get a lot of speaking invitations to know that, let's say you're in downtown DC speaking to a group of CIOs, and I would think the basic information you would give them would be to worry about their credentials and maybe use multi-factor authentication. But then I've been reading stories about multi-factor authentication frequently relies on the public phone network, which can be compromised. And so it seems like it's just everyone's one step ahead in this game.
Everything you just said is true. The MFA has certainly improved security, but it's not impenetrable. It's not perfect. And so there are ways around it. But still, the number one concern in terms of being able to socially engineer, criminals are socially engineering their way into networks is really through that initial identity access point where somebody is not taking very good care of their own security hygiene and has not changed their password.
So if you looked at the 5 pillars or 4 pillars of zero trust from NIST, the first pillar is identification. I guess you'd agree with them, huh, Joel?
I would. I agree that the first pillar should be identification. That's exactly right.
Looking into the future, you have a storied past. You've been all different levels. So do you think there's going to be some kind of an incident that's going to really light the fire behind people and have them much more interested in moving up their level of identification? Or where do you see this whole general field headed in the next 4 or 5 years?
From a technology perspective, we're starting to see organizations using not only MFA, multi-factor authentication, but substituting passwords for other types of credentials and biometrics. And so that's a trend that I think is going to continue. The other thing that we're seeing is that there's a lot more discipline and awareness in the system right now, which is healthy and good. And so that's an area where I think we'll also see an increase in training and awareness and people not responding to an alert to change a password or a credential, but proactively changing it as just a normal pattern of behavior, pattern of life. It's something like, on the lines of if you wash your clothes once a week, while you're washing your clothes and waiting for the clothes to dry, you're changing your password on all your accounts. Things like that, as mundane as that may sound, isn't something that somebody would have changed their password on a weekly basis, not something people would have done a year or two ago. And so we're starting to see that type of behavior too, which is very practical and very good. And then in terms of enterprise systems, there's an awful lot of very interesting work being done in tying biometrics and identity to layer 2 systems and accessing, early on in the initial handshake between systems that there's an identity and a credential check that's being done much earlier in the process. So all those things taken in aggregate are going to improve credential security going forward.
The software developers talk about shifting left, and maybe the identity management people, that's what I hear when you say L2, that's a shift to the left, that's the before the boom.
That's
maybe
right.
Several steps before the boom.
No doubt about it. And that's where we need to be is, as we talked about just a little bit ago, the prevention mindset now is very, very important. And so getting ahead of this challenges is very, very important. And so, yes, it is early on in the process as you can establish a security credential as possible, and maintaining that throughout the session is extremely important.
So I'm going to end with your website again, SpyCloud.com. And if I were you, I'd get the 2022 Identity Exposure Report and then get stunned by the numbers and don't believe that numbers of passwords are floating around the internet. I never thought of the reverse of it. I never thought that companies like Joel's can actually take and get the passwords for the malicious actors and maybe keep a step of everyone and then do the proverbial move to the left or left of boom, another phrase that I've seen used many, many times. You've been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Jole Bagnal, Director, Federal for SpyCloud.
Thank you so much, John, for this time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.